Hello, good evening. I would like to thank you all, the speakers, but also the participants for participating and attending our late afternoon event. We are gathered here today to debate about a very serious and critical issue that has been magnified during this crisis period. This issue is drug policies and need to reform them, as they are causing more harm than the substances themselves. According to recent studies, 1 out of 4 Europeans use or have used illicit substances in their lifetime, while more than 85 million people in Europe use or have used cannabis. That is a huge number of citizens to consider as criminals, and for sure they cannot fit in prisons around Europe. We need to find other ways to address the needs of those people in a more humane and just manner that treats addiction and drug abuse as a public health issue and not as a judicial one. Although their growth rate has stabilized, the numbers of European users are greater than ever, especially the problematic ones. Still, more than 7,000 drug-related deaths occur annually in Europe. New and very dangerous substances, synthetic substances, emerge every week as a result of prohibition policy. Polydrug use has become a serious trend among youth, and the economic crisis has exaggerated the problem of drug abuse, especially in the more vulnerable countries like Greece. Just to give you an indication, in my own country, the case of HIV infection among drug users increased from 15 in 1 year, 2009, to 484 in 2012. The tuberculosis cases among them showed a similar increase, while funding for primary care and treatment was decreased more than 25% or 50% sometimes during the same period. Reitox centers have a waiting list of 4,000 people, while more than half of the people incarcerated in Greek prisons are drug users and petit dealers. Every year we are spending billions of euros and valuable human resources into an ineffective policy that relies heavily on policing and judicial efforts rather than prevention and therapy. In countries like Greece, but also in Europe as a whole, the majority of public funds, almost 80%, are still spent on policing, judging and incarcerating people, while only 20% of the funds are spent on prevention, treatment and rehabilitation. Despite all that money, 50 years of focusing on prohibition policies have not produced the desired results, as we have not been able to reduce neither supply nor demand of illicit substances, according to studies financed by the European Commission. The great numbers of users still face criminalization and stigmatization, while organized crime is gathering more wealth than ever, more than $400 billion annually, feeding in turn political corruption and money laundering. The European Parliament has voted the rather progressive Catania report since 2004, but unfortunately it is not transposed into EU policy yet. The Commission needs to break the inertia of competences on social policy and undertake a serious leading role towards securing public health, freedom, and the rights of drug consumers. We really need a cost-benefit analysis of the applied prohibition policies, as well as study of the benefits of alternative policy options based on decriminalization, harm reduction, and regulation of supply. International developments of alternative regulator models have shown great results, like in Portugal, Switzerland, and Holland, while others, like the recent in Uruguay and the USA models on cannabis supply, are still to present results but look quite promising. Harm reduction policies and initiatives like the injection rooms are gaining lots of attention but are usually underfunded. Alternative cannabis supply models like the non-profit social clubs are gaining widespread support as they tackle organized crime, promote safe use and contribute to local economy. In 10 days, the UN Commission on Drugs will take place in Vienna and the voices of concern and reform are multiplying. The EU should take a leading role, although it is very difficult with 28 different countries, I know, but should take a leading role in that reform process for the benefit of the European citizens. One is for sure, people since the ancient years have been using substances. That will not change, and it is totally unrealistic to speak about a full drug-free Europe. We need science-based policies that rely on best practices and not on ideology and moral panic. Tonight, we have the honor to host some distinguished guests to debate on this very critical issue. And it's Ruth Dreifuss, former president of the Swiss Federal State and member of Global Commission on Drug Policy. Valérie Couran, professor of psychopharmacology at University College London, Wolfgang Goetz, director of EMCDDA, Paola Tardioli-Schiavo, deputy head of Unit DG Justice, European Commission, and Mike Trace, International Drug Policy Consortium. Maybe you know all of them. But let's first see the highly acclaimed documentary, Breaking the Taboo, and then we will pass the floor to our speakers. Thanks a lot.
Drug wars. They've been declared on local, regional, and national levels.
We seized our heroin.
69 tons of marijuana.
We are not going to allow the cartels to take over the United States.
I have authorization to fire into your vessel.
In 2011, a group of world leaders, including 7 ex-presidents, set up the Global Commission on Drug Policy to end the 40-year war on drugs. But wars are easier to start than they are to finish. It's June 1971, and President Richard Milhous Nixon is in a fighting mood.
We must wage what I have called total war against public enemy number 1 in the United States, the problem of dangerous drugs.
That was a time where you had both rising levels of sort of crime and there was more sort of agitation around civil rights and all of this. You also had the hippies and you had marijuana, you had the counterculture. And Richard Nixon saw himself as speaking for the silent majority, the silent middle class.
The answer for a country already fighting one war in Vietnam? Another one, on drugs. To combat the number of Americans using illegal narcotics.
What really tipped Nixon over was starting in 1970. There became a tremendous amount of intravenous heroin use in Vietnam, and that really kicked him over.
I shall soon propose a revision of the entire federal criminal code, which will give us tougher penalties against drugs and against crime.
But the war on drugs would not be confined to the United States. In order to stem the production and supply of illegal narcotics, America has sought, even insisted upon, help from the rest of the world.
The American government convinced the United Nations and the other governments that the main goal for United Nations will be in the area of drugs to zero drugs, to avoid any kind of drug. And secondly, that the instrument to get this goal was repression, war on drugs.
The UN Conventions on Drugs amounted to a global ban on producing, transporting, selling, and possessing any drug classified as illegal. And it set in stone an attitude to narcotics that has lasted for decades.
So in the crusade for a drug-free America, the next step is to enforce a policy of zero tolerance of illegal drug use. So when we say no to drugs, it'll be clear that we mean absolutely none.
Yet, in spite of the massive and sustained efforts of law enforcement, demand for illegal drugs has continued to rise.
We do not wish to do so.
Heroin use spiked in the early 70s. Then there was cocaine.
The government was completely unprepared for the explosive growth of the drug problems. I think we totally misunderstood cocaine.
Originalmente Colombia era el país donde se procesaba, pero la producción estaba en Bolivia y en Perú. Después también se empezó a cultivar en Colombia y los carteles de la droga se fueron volviendo muy poderosos.
America's insatiable appetite for cocaine made criminals like Pablo Escobar the richest and most powerful of all time. Escobar's cartel was smuggling 15 tons of cocaine a day into the U.S., and in 1989, Forbes magazine declared him the 7th richest man in the world, worth an estimated $25 billion. Cesar Gaviria was president of Colombia during the state's fight against Escobar.
Escobar tenía una red clandestina muy grande, era impresionantemente poderoso, la gente le tenía mucho temor. Más que corrupción, la gente le tenía intimidada a toda la sociedad.
Escobar's policy of dealing with law enforcement was plata o plomo, a bribe or a bullet. And when the U.S. and Colombian governments finally took him on, the ensuing struggle made Colombia the murder capital of the world, with over 52,000 violent deaths in 2 years. And even the president wasn't immune.
Una de estas organizaciones alimentada por el narcotráfico tuvo a mi hermano secuestrado bajo tierra sin poderse mover durante 3 meses sin cambiarse la ropa, salió completamente traumatizado, paralizado, fue una cosa muy traumática. Hace un par de años las FARC, que son hoy el principal cartel de droga de Colombia, mató a mi hermana tratando de secuestrarla para convertirla en un rehén y en una persona con la que pudieran hacer una negociación política. Y esto ocurre en todas las familias colombianas. O sea, todos han sido víctimas o de la guerrilla o del narcotráfico, y esa guerrilla está cada vez alimentada por droga.
Escobar was finally gunned down by police in December of 1993. But America and Colombia's drug problems were to continue long after the downfall of El Patron.
The death of Pablo Escobar and the working in the United States with Colombia to get him out and killed was a kind of boost to those efforts. But I don't think anyone in the supply reduction area ever felt that was going to end the problem.
Demand continued after Escobar's death, and so did supply. The next stage of the war on drugs was another large-scale attempt to wipe out the drugs at source. President Bill Clinton's Plan Colombia.
What I tried to do was to focus on every aspect of the problem. I tried to empower the Colombians, for example, to do more militarily and police-wise because I thought that they had to. 30% of their country was in the hands of the narco-traffickers.
The U.S. spent billions of dollars funding military operations in Colombia to cut off the flow of cocaine into America by eradicating Colombia's coca plantations.
Colombia es el único país del mundo que fumiga aéreamente los cultivos de droga. Es un tipo de fumigación que destruye mucho todos los cultivos aledaños.
It's a war against people who try just to earn their living growing some plant. They would like to grow something else if they would receive the same money. So I mean, you cannot make a war against drugs without knowing that doing so, you are making a war against people.
Cuando el Plan Colombia empezó, había 8 departamentos donde había sembrados de coca. Hoy hay 24 o 28, alguna cosa así.
Well, obviously, if the expected results was that we would eliminate serious drug use in America and eliminate the narco-trafficking networks, it hasn't worked.
Today, the illegal drugs trade amounts to $320 billion a year. And without laws or governments to regulate this underground market, guns and violence have inevitably become the most effective method of control.
Eu sei o quanto é perigoso ir de helicóptero a algumas favelas. Você vai desviando, porque se acharem que é polícia, os traficantes atiram.
As president of Brazil, Fernando Cardoso followed the prevailing thinking of his time and was a supporter of the war on drugs. On his watch, a new national anti-drug agency was established. Now, 8 years later, as chair of the Global Commission on Drug Policy, Cardoso is back to see for himself what the fight against narcotics has done to favelas like these.
Let me tell you very frankly, when I went to visit some of the favelas in a very violent part of Rio, I was a little bit afraid. I had no security, because a precondition of being accepted into these neighborhoods is to go without guns. They have the guns, not me.
Há 60 anos era 22, 32. É. Aí veio, há 40 anos já começou oitão, pistola, 12 de cano cerrado. Aí depois veio fuzil, metralhadora, HK, AK-47 e assim vem.
Ou seja, para você faz uma ligação direta entre o tipo de arma, a entrada da arma e a mudança do tráfico.
É isso aí. Cada vez que mudava de um tipo de arma para o outro, era outro traficante, era outra pessoa, era outros.
Isso aumentava também a capacidade de venda e tal ou não?
Aumentava mais a criminalidade.
A criminalidade, né? A matança.
Mais a matança.
Moro numa localidade que estava tendo guerra entre facções rivais. Aí eu saí com a minha namorada, eu tinha ido a uma festa. Foi a hora que aconteceu. Eu tomei um tiro, não sei da onde, não vi da onde. As pessoas que pagam, as pessoas mesmo da comunidade que não tem nada a ver, sempre são os que levam sempre a pior. Aí fiquei desse jeito. Tinha 18, 19 anos.
When I was in favelas, what struck me was, first of all, the humanitarian situation. People. It's not difficult to understand how violence and use of drugs is, devastating people. It's terrible. When I was in office in Brazil, of course I was aware of the situation of drugs, but I was convinced that through repression to be possible to stop the production of drugs. But I was wrong at the time.
Yet the suffering experienced in Rio's favelas pales in comparison with the wave of violence unleashed in Mexico, where a battle for control of lucrative trafficking routes over the U.S. border has spiraled out of control.
The Mexican president understood that the situation was very bad because of drug battles, and he decided to confront.
America's Merida Initiative, known to critics as Plan Mexico, has seen President Calderon spend over $1 billion on the Mexican drug war since 2008. More than 50,000 soldiers and federal police are now actively involved in the fight against the cartels. But as in Colombia before it, the violence has exploded as the drug cartels fight against the police, the army, and each other.
It's President Calderon's decision to declare war on the cartels back in 2006 and to use the army against them that I think has generated the violence. I think that the war has created the situation. The situation did not create the war. The problem with this is that the Mexican military is not trained for this. It's not trained for police missions, and this is a police task. And you're asking it to fight a war it cannot win, and it knows it is not winning. And so the military go in and they shoot. That's what soldiers do. All of this has been going on now for 4 or 5 years, and it's getting worse and worse and worse.
Since President Calderon declared his war on drugs in 2006, there have been over 47,000 drug-related murders in Mexico. And the cartels are increasingly targeting elected officials, journalists, and members of the justice system. The government is beginning to lose control of entire regions.
Que este problema no lo vamos a resolver solo los mexicanos, que los mexicanos debemos reclamarle enérgicamente a los Estados Unidos y a los otros grandes países consumidores que tomen una mayor responsabilidad en la solución de este tema.
The United States has always led the war on drugs from the front, both at home and abroad. But 5 decades of an unyielding reliance on police enforcement and the fact that America remains the planet's largest consumer of illegal drugs has had a devastating effect on the land of the free.
Using illegal drugs is against the law. Doing drugs, you risk everything, even your freedom. If you do drugs, you will be caught. And when you're caught, you will be punished. Some think there won't be room for them in jail. We'll make room.
You know, the thing about the United States, we have less than 5% of the world's population, but almost 25% of the world's incarcerated population, roughly about 2.3 million people behind bars tonight. Now, what's the number one thing driving that? It's the war on drugs.
A kilo of pure cocaine costs $1,000 when it leaves a Colombian plantation. By the time it reaches the street in the U.S., it can be worth over $170,000.
The illegality of drugs creates a situation where they're expensive. Now, if you're a wealthy person, then maybe you can afford your own addiction. But the vast majority of street users resort to crime or prostitution or their own drug dealing to support their own addiction.
A heavy user of heroin or cocaine has to spend up to 10 times more per week than a heavy user of alcohol or tobacco.
It's not that cocaine, heroin, marijuana cost any more than alcohol or tobacco to produce. Think about it. If tomorrow people could get heroin or cocaine legally from a store, and tomorrow you could only get alcohol or cigarettes from the black market, then all of a sudden very few people would be committing crimes in order to support their heroin or cocaine habit, and lots of people would be committing crimes to support their alcohol or tobacco habit.
What the war on drugs has done is it's created this massive prison industrial complex in America. In 1970, there were about 330,000 prisoners in the U.S. Now there are 2.3 million, and we somehow consider that normal. 2.3 million prisoners is more than any other country in the history of the world ever. We have more prisoners than China, and they have 1 billion more people than we do. We have more prisoners than soldiers, but there are more prison guards than there are U.S. Marines. This level of incarceration has just taken on a life of its own.
We know that people can be rehabilitated, but the truth is, most of these people who are minor offenders who get sent to prisons get no rehabilitation.
If you didn't have a drug habit going in, you leave going with a drug habit. There was so much drugs in prison, it was unbelievable. You could get any kind of drug you want in prison. If you can't control drug use in a maximum security prison, how could you control drugs in a free society?
We need look no further than Washington's own doorstep to see the effect that the drug war is having on whole regions of America. In 1950, Baltimore City had over 1 million inhabitants. Today, there are just over half that number. There are 50,000 derelict buildings, and almost 10% of the residents are addicted to an illegal drug.
I can remember the night that my sister was burned. My mother's house caught fire. It was a result of my youngest brother being high for heroin. So, she lived for 3 weeks, and she died. And, that night that we buried her, a friend of the family came past, and he told me, he said, try this. And I said, what is that? He said, just try it, it'll make you feel better. It was like this warm feeling just went through my whole body. And it was like, where has this been all my life? You know, and what it was heroin. I think before I realized it was a problem, it was like years had went past. I lost everything. I would go in department stores and I would steal. And I got locked up a couple times. By the time I had got to that point, I was really tired. You know, I wanted a way out, but I didn't know how, you know, or what I was going to do to stop.
There are 600,000 people in this city. In 2007, there were 100,000 arrests. The numbers are staggering when you begin to think about what that means for people. If you have a criminal conviction, generally you are excluded from any support for housing. You are excluded for support for education, and you're not able to get an ever-increasing array of jobs because of your conviction. The reality is that you return to the drug trade. And the drug trade begins to occupy entire communities.
In the neighborhood I policed, men who are born there have about a 12% chance of getting murdered in their lifetime. It seems like these problems are far more important than some sort of futile goal of creating a drug-free society. People should care more about all these deaths, and by and large, the vast majority are related to prohibition.
We could have fighting and killing over cigarettes if we made it a felony to sell a cigarette or to smoke one. So we legalized them. If all you do is try to find a police or military solution to the problem, a lot of people die and it doesn't solve the problem.
But repressive drug policies and their grave consequences stretch far beyond the Americas. Amid the chaos of war, Afghanistan has emerged as the main producer of heroin in the world.
Afghanistan has become like the Walmart of dope. The quantities of drugs that are moving out of Afghanistan regularly are simply colossal. They are unimaginable. They make the quantities that Pablo Escobar moved look like child's play.
A major use of the enormous profits from the production of poppies and therefore heroin goes to the Taliban to finance their illicit operations in subjugating people and in punishing people.
But U.S.-led efforts to cut off Taliban funding by eradicating the poppy crops have in fact driven farmers into the arms of the insurgents.
In this incredibly insecure, lethally uncertain environment, the one crop that they could depend on to bring in enough money to live off, the United States came in to help destroy that.
And of course, once they had lost their source of livelihood, they were then much more open to being persuaded by a Taliban recruitment officer here to take a rifle, take some dollars for the day, and go and shoot at British, American, Afghan soldiers.
It really just contributed massively to getting us to where we are today in Afghanistan, the mess that we have today.
Go, go, go!
Just cut round with it. The thing that sticks in my mind was a direct order to find pictures of burning opium. How can any military task involve taking a picture of burning opium? And I think it is indicative of who was requesting this. This was someone whose prime motivation was counter-narcotics rather than the counterinsurgency campaign or the benefit and well-being of the people of Afghanistan.
Under the Obama administration, the official counter-narcotics policy in Afghanistan has shifted away from eradication. But with the announcement that U.S. and NATO troops will be withdrawn in 2014, calls for widespread eradication of the poppy are growing, and not only from the West.
С коллапсом Советского Союза проблема наркопотребления пошла в гору. На эту тенденцию наложился рост наркопроизводства, взрывной рост наркопроизводства в Афганистане с 2001 года.
Russia wants to take serious action and has been very vocal in the last year calling for a wide-scale eradication program in Afghanistan. They find it inconceivable that the United States thinks that the biggest threat emanating from Afghanistan is terrorism. They say the biggest threat emanating from Afghanistan is narcotics.
And Russian policymakers of today look backwards to the repressive example set by the United States in the 1990s.
США завершила реализацию так называемого плана Колумбия, в соответствии с которым было у них соглашение между США и Колумбией по вопросам как эрадикации посевов, уничтожения лабораторий и иным мероприятиям, направленным на искоренение наркопроизводства. Мне кажется, это хороший опыт Соединенных Штатов Америки, который нам, России, следовало бы самым активным образом применять на практике.
In 2010, U.S. and Russian forces took part in a joint raid on a drug lab in Afghanistan. And Russia's influence in Afghanistan's war on drugs continues to grow.
As we leave and transition, which will be delicate enough anyway, if in that window of opportunity of transition, those who wish to push the counter-narcotics agenda get their way, and we do see a short, sharp attempt to eradicate poppy, I think that will spell disaster for the country. And a return to the disruptive anarchy that spawned 9/11 and what we came here to rectify.
Get on the ground, now!
Old orthodoxies persist on how to best deal with the supply of narcotics. So how has the war on drugs dealt with the demand?
This is drugs. This is your brain on drugs.
During the time I was in Congress, we tried almost everything we could think of. We got corporations to donate an enormous amount of money to go into public advertising, hard-hitting advertisements that showed kids the terrible things that would happen with drugs.
Toda a propaganda antidroga da minha época
era baseada no fato de que a droga destruía o ser humano.
That had a problem because most of the people who were using drugs weren't dead, and they liked to use the drugs, and so it had a credibility problem.
You're gonna die if you mess with dope. Nobody can handle it. Take a look at the nearest junkie and figure it out.
E aí, o jovem questiona todo o discurso que ele ouviu até então.
Hey, kiddies, gather round. The man with the goodies is here. Dig, everybody. LSD.
Então, nesse momento, fica claro que há uma hipocrisia generalizada na campanha antidrogas, normalmente feita por pessoa que nunca experimentou a droga. Então, essas pessoas vêm com esse discurso moralista, conservador, e acham que vão impressionar muita gente. Não vão.
Come on, one drag won't hurt you.
That's not what I heard. I heard it can really mess you up. You heard wrong. Come on, give it a try. It's cool. You don't know what you're doing. Besides, smoking pot's illegal.
Or maybe you're just a little
too... The moralization of these campaigns produced a polarization between the users and the believers of the campaign messages, who believe that anyone who uses the drug is an addict and a criminal. And politicians have fallen into this trap too.
You point your finger at our generation and you say, well, you had alcohol, you had martinis and so forth, and that was your crutch. Well, maybe so. But then what makes you so much more noble by just deciding to have a different kind of crutch? I'd like to see a generation that didn't have any crutch at all.
Today, a generation after President Reagan left office, the UN estimates there are 230 million drug users in the world. 90% of them are not classified as problematic. And yet the question of how to deal with these people has divided politicians ever since President Nixon first declared his war on drugs.
Nixon's attitude about drugs was very interesting. His instincts were all law enforcement, all punishment, no sympathy, but a very strong commitment to dealing with the problem. Nixon said I could say anything I wanted to say about drugs except one thing. I couldn't support decriminalization of marijuana. He said he was elected president, not me, and if I came out and supported decriminalization, I was history.
60% of the Berkeley voters approved the marijuana ordinance. It specifically told the Berkeley police not to make marijuana arrests without first getting city council approval.
Decriminalization was the permissive pole of drug policy, and it said essentially that there would be no criminal penalty for possession of marijuana. And we had a presidential commission to look at this issue. Nixon appointed the people, and they came out and supported it.
We have made several recommendations to the Congress, to the President, and to the American people. The federal recommendations are as follows. First, possession for personal use is no longer a criminal offense. Second, non-profit distribution of small amounts should no longer be a criminal offense.
So Nixon dissociated himself from the commission report that he'd put together, and he just said, that's not going to happen on my watch.
But Nixon ultimately had bigger issues to worry about than the war on drugs. It was the Watergate scandal, not narcotics, that was his undoing.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
So Nixon is gone and Ford is there. He doesn't have this guidance for me. So I came out and supported decriminalization. And I was a poster drug czar for decriminalization at that point.
With the election of Jimmy Carter in 1977, decriminalization found itself at the forefront of the mainstream political agenda. An end to the war on drugs was in sight.
When I was president, we had the same problem with drug production and distribution and consumption that we presently face. We tried as best we could to minimize the emphasis on criminal punishment. And I made a major statement to the U.S. Congress asking for changes in the law.
And decriminalization spread to 10 U.S. states by 1979. And it would look like the future. It would look like that things were going to go that direction. Then the parents' movement came in, and it stopped, and nobody decriminalized again.
Under the Reagan administration, a hardline policy of zero tolerance reignited the drug war and would entrench political attitudes for years to come.
President Reagan and his wife adopted the drug program as the #1 issue for her to proclaim. She had a phrase, just say no.
Just say no so loud that everyone around you can hear. And if you do that, drugs won't stand a chance.
And she made it clear that her prohibition against drugs included marijuana and everything else. So I don't think there's any doubt that President Reagan made a profound impact then on the consciousness of our country, and I think he also shaped the opinion of many members of our Congress.
The truth is, the vast majority of members of Congress still take a very hard position on drugs. We're against legalizing drugs. We want tougher penalties for drug users, and particularly for people who sell and traffic in the drugs. We want to maintain the long terms, the prison terms and penalties that are there.
In 2009, there were 1.6 million drug-related arrests in the U.S. 1.3 million of these were for possession of drugs alone, and over half were related to marijuana.
I personally fully disagree with the U.S. saying that they are being successful just because they have more people in jail or they have more sentences against traffickers than they had 20 or 10 or 5 years ago. That is not a good way to say that a policy is successful.
This project over the past 22 months has led to the arrest of more than 2,200 individuals.
We seized their heroin, taken their money.
41 kilograms of cocaine.
$154 million in United States currency.
Every year is the same. They are showing some data, and the data shows more people in prison. We are destroying more plantations of cocaine, so on and so forth.
If they had less violence and less consumption, and well, that would be a success. But what they have now, and the measure of success they have, is wrong.
We have spent hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars on the war on drugs, which has been a complete, total failure.
The problem is that politicians are basically unwilling to spend political capital on this issue, as they know it's unpopular with the public and the media.
What is his position, as you understand it, on drug use? Apparently he has a somewhat libertarian view on that subject, which you, I think, are arguing is not a Kentucky view.
I had a senior law enforcement official tell me that in his judgment, up to a quarter of the White House staff, when they first came in, had used drugs in the last 4 or 5 years.
Accusations about the use of illegal drugs are flying around the Democratic presidential campaign again.
What we have in this issue is similar to what we have in pornography. This is chemical pornography.
The allegation is that while governor, he hosted parties where drugs were used, a violation of state law.
Most politicians, they're afraid of what the political ads will be that their opponents will run in the upcoming election. They're afraid of being accused of being soft on crime or soft on drugs, and that's why oftentimes the politicians lag behind the public. Why? Because the politicians are still stuck.
The party's over. The party's over for drug dealers. We can change the status quo, we can win the war, but we've got to start the war on drugs.
The U.S. just ignores the problem. In this society, it's almost prohibited, banned to talk about the problem.
So you have to break taboo.
In 2011, the Global Commission on Drug Policy set out to correct the mistakes of the past and change the very nature of the war on drugs.
I'm not proposing to replace war by peace. I propose to replace war by a smarter fight. A fight using other instruments, more intelligent instruments to convince people not to use drugs.
So break the taboo and bring in the public debate what experiences in some countries could help to find better solutions.
Portugal has a brave new approach to the drug problem. In 2001, they decriminalized the use of all drugs, meaning that users would no longer face criminal punishment for possession alone.
To see the progress made in Portugal is astonishing, because in Portugal they decided to decriminalize the use of all kinds of drugs, and not just marijuana.
Decriminalized, people do not go to prison, do not go to court even, but there's a penalty that can be applied, and there's a clear sign of disapproval for drug use.
If someone is arrested with drugs in Portugal, they are not taken to court. Instead, they are brought before a dissuasion board made up of psychiatrists and social workers.
The main concern is to understand what are the needs of that people intercepted by police forces using drugs or carrying drugs for personal use, and what do they need? What kind of help can we provide?
The most fundamental step we need to take is to realize that addiction is a medical problem, and therefore addicts need to be treated medically, not criminally. If we accept that basic principle, we overcome most of the disagreements about drug policy.
In Portugal, after decriminalization, the prevalence of drug use among youngsters has declined in the last decade of every illicit drug.
In 1997, drug addiction was officially the #1 political concern in Portugal. Now, after a decade of decriminalization, the issue has fallen as far down as 13th and hardly registers on the political agenda. And even more radical steps have been taken elsewhere. In the 90s, Switzerland faced an AIDS epidemic rapidly spreading through the heroin-using population.
It was clear in Switzerland that repression was not the way, that repression was a part of the problem, that repression was a cause of the dissemination of AIDS, that repression was a cause of the deaths of young people by overdoses.
As president, Global Commissioner Ruth Dreyfus called for a series of dramatic solutions to the epidemic, including medically prescribing clean needles and heroin to addicts who couldn't kick the habit.
How can you speak with people about the problem of drugs if they are addicts, if they are under the threat to be arrested? It's absolutely clear that you have to go to the people, and in order to go to the people, you have to accept in a certain way the people as they are.
In Switzerland, the number of injecting drug users with HIV/AIDS has been reduced by over 50% in 10 years. And the model of putting health before punishment is gathering momentum.
I think there should be safe places where people who have addiction could come and not think they're going to be arrested and will have basic needs met. I have experience with this, including personal experience. I had a brother who was addicted to cocaine. So I know a lot about this. I understand more than most people do what is involved.
Well, dealing with human beings. So we are not just dealing with criminals. The users, very often, they want to escape from the situation. They have no instruments. So why not to give a lift to them?
Who are the addicts? Our children. I mean, people we love. People we would like really to bring back in the normal life.
The American experience with alcohol prohibition provides a wonderful analogy for the problems that we're experiencing today with drug prohibition. By the end of alcohol prohibition, more people were drinking alcohol than at the beginning of alcohol prohibition. And at the same time, you now created Al Capone, and organized crime and violence and corruption, and young people looking up to bootleggers as role models, and shootouts and violence in the streets. You look what's going on in Mexico today, or Central America, or the Caribbean. It's almost like Chicago during the days of Al Capone and Prohibition times 50. So much today of what people identify as part and parcel of the drug problem are in fact the results of our failed prohibitionist policies.
A drug-free world is a fantasy. The war on drugs didn't do away with people's desire for drugs. All it managed to create was a network of criminal supply routes to fulfill the demand.
In 2005, the UN estimated that criminals were trading more than $320 billion a year on the illegal drug market.
The UN estimates that almost 50% of organized crime's profits come from the drug trade. Eliminating this source of revenue would be a devastating blow to criminal cartels.
I am sure that regulation by the state with very clear limitation is the solution.
And then, of course, there are the financial benefits of regulation to consider. The saving on police and incarceration and the profits of taxation.
In 2008, Harvard economist Jeffrey Myron estimated that regulating and taxing drugs would inject over $76 billion a year into the U.S. economy alone.
So imagine if we could turn this thing around across the board, and instead of wasting hundreds of billions of dollars a year, putting those hundreds of billions into the hands of criminals, bringing in the tax revenue instead. What a tremendous savings at a time when so many governments are facing really gross fiscal problems.
A country that has already moved in this direction is Holland, where it is in practice legal to buy and sell small quantities of cannabis in coffee shops. Today, ex-Brazilian President Fernando Cardoso has come to see this for himself.
You are not allowed to advertise cannabis. You are not allowed to sell any hard drugs. You are not allowed to sell cannabis to people under 18 years old. You're allowed to have only 500 grams in stock as a coffee shop, and don't sell more than 5 grams a day to one person. The good thing about a business in soft drugs and cannabis in the coffee shop is that it's without any violence.
And what have been the consequences regarding the users?
Well, people might think that it would have led to a sharp increase in cannabis use, because in practice it's free available cannabis. But you will see, if you look at the statistics, that the consumption is quite comparable with surrounding countries.
In spite of Holland's liberal cannabis laws, consumption rates are lower than in surrounding countries like France, Germany, Denmark, and the UK. But would a legally regulated market open itself to big business like alcohol and tobacco did in the past?
New Bel Air, so refreshing. Winston tastes good like it should. Change to Winston, you'll change for good. 'Cause Winston tastes good like a cigarette should.
Look, no one wants their drugs free for all. We need to regulate and control how drugs are produced and sold. No advertising, no selling to minors, labeling dangers. And in fact, tobacco policy today actually shows how effective regulation and good education can be.
We need to regulate drugs the same way we regulate normal cigarettes. In many ways, those are great success stories. We've reduced use by half over a generation or two. If we could do that with heroin and cocaine, that would be a great victory.
The fact of the matter is, when a drug is really dangerous, smart education and smart regulations can reduce use very, very substantially.
E aí você tem que ser honesto na sua abordagem. Seja aberto, seja honesto. Diga isso, realmente a droga é fantástica, você vai gostar. Mas cuidado, hein? Porque você não vai poder decidir mais nada. Basta isso, basta isso. O grande perigo da droga é que ela mata a coisa mais importante que você vai precisar na vida. É o teu poder de decidir. A única coisa que você tem na sua vida é o seu poder de decisão.
Don't be drug free because it's illegal. Be drug free because it's the key to your freedom. It's the key to your future.
After a year of investigation, the Global Commission gathers in New York to present its findings to the world.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the press conference of the Global Commission on Drug Policy.
The fact is that the war on drugs is a failure.
The consumption is not being reduced.
It's cost millions of dollars.
The increasing number of people in jail is there in the statistics.
And it's fueled organized crime worldwide.
Stop the war on drugs, and let's be more constructive in trying to reduce the consumption.
The strategy of drug prohibition has failed, according to the Global Commission on Drug Policy, an admission by world leaders, including 4 former presidents, a prime minister, and a former UN Secretary General.
Organized crime and cost billions of dollars.
Drug policy has failed.
The most striking thing about the Global Commission is the media reaction to it. My God, it's off the scale. It's everywhere.
The message of the Global Commission came in the right moment and allowed a certain crystallization around this call for breaking the taboo all over the world.
But it is not just the media that reacts. The White House also has something to say.
When the Global Commission came out with its statement, I could have predicted in advance exactly what the drug czar was going to say.
We have spoken about our opposition to legalizing drugs because we know that legalizing drugs is not an answer. We also know...
I think essentially the role of the drug czar in America today is to refrain from any substantive debate about what's wrong with drug policy today. It's to point their fingers at the little signs of progress and ignore all the signs of failure. It's to make sure that this issue doesn't blow up one way or another for the president.
The incarceration approach to drugs.
In 2004, Senator Obama described the war on drugs as an utter failure.
I, Barack Hussein Obama, do solemnly swear.
As president, however, he has not implemented substantial change, with funding for law enforcement still almost twice that allocated for treatment and prevention.
It was not a surprise to see the resistance, because governments have to be more conservative. It's difficult for governments to change. They are afraid because of vote. They don't want to innovate. And the world requires more innovation. And the fact that now ministers and important personalities are joining us is a signal of progress.
There are dozens, if not hundreds, including people in power today who think the same way and don't feel the confidence, the political confidence, the personal confidence to speak out. But when you see this group of such distinction, people who left offices with their reputations intact, people who are oftentimes globally known, standing up and saying enough is enough, that hopefully can embolden others to say the same thing.
In 2011, President Santos of Colombia became the first serving president to break the silence and publicly declare that the world needs to look for new solutions.
Colombia has been fighting drugs and the drug cartels for 40 years. But the business is still going on. And sometimes I feel like in a static bicycle. You work hard, and then you suddenly look to your right, look to your left, and you're almost in the same place. And you see what happens in Mexico and Guatemala. And so I think a new approach, or at least to try to open up, to break the taboo, is what the world should do. There are many alternatives, including the possibility of legalizing drugs. Politically, I know that this has cost, and I have already incurred those costs. They have attacked me for saying what I am saying to you. But I don't think politicians or leaders of any country can only say what people want to hear. In Latin America, there is a growing concern. Before, this was a taboo, and you have to break this taboo. And the taboo has been broken.
Now, for the first time in 4 decades, the countries that have suffered most from this war on drugs are talking back and initiating their own reforms unilaterally.
you have a situation where Latin American leaders of great stature in their countries, great stature in the world, can go to the United States and say, look, this is not working, let's do something else.
Estamos poniendo en la mesa un tema de debate. Ya fue una propuesta del presidente Cardoso, ya una propuesta del presidente Gaviria de Colombia y que ahí ha estado. Y lo que queremos es traerlo nuevamente al debate.
For the first time in history, at the 2012 Summit of the Americas, it was announced that investigating alternative drug policies would become part of the official regional agenda.
The truth is that the war on drugs is a war fought inside the heart and mind of everybody who thinks of using them. But I know that lives can be saved, that they're worth saving, that it's never too late to start. And as long as you have your personal freedom, the ability to think, you have a chance to do better. Don't give that freedom up. That's my message.
I'm not unrealistic. I know that it's difficult to change, but I know also the society does change. It will depend largely on people, on civil society.
We are now at the beginning of a new phase where the public debate will be possible. And I'm sure that will help to change the policy, not only in the US, but also in the world.
It depends heavily on people's pressure for governments to change. Altogether, we are breaking the taboo on drugs.
Yes. Okay. Please take the seat. I think it was a very interesting film, and I think we'll give some food for thought. Okay. Mike Trace will coordinate the debate.
Okay, thank you very much, Nikos, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you enjoyed the film. As our panel this evening gather on the front desk. So what I think we're going to do, we're starting a little late on this section, and I've asked the speakers to help with you because this is an evening session after a long day for all of us to help us move through this next section. So we're going to have a number of speeches from a wide variety of perspectives, and we'll receive those presentations. And then when we've heard from our panel members, I will introduce a discussion to the floor. So I'm very much hoping you have the energy to contribute your thoughts when we get to the open discussion at the end of the prepared speeches. So with no further ado, I will pass to our first and main speaker of the evening, the former health minister and president of Switzerland and film star we've just seen, and now member of the Global Commission. So Ruth Dreyfus, would you like to start us off?
Thank you, Mike. Yes, I had the opportunity to speak to you through the movie, so I will be very, very brief. And also because I prefer to have the opportunity to have an exchange with all of you. When I watched this movie, I participated in it, in the different version it took. I think on one side, it's amazing what happened in the time from the beginning of this adventure, the beginning also of the Global Commission on Drug Policy. And on the other side, this movie is updated. It is updated because the taboo now is broken. I think the discussion is taking place everywhere, in countries, on the ground, in international fora, so that the call of the movie, of the documentary, to break the taboo is a call that now is not necessary to repeat. And this is the amazing acceleration we had witnessed in this last 4 or 5 years, because it's in this period that really the discussion came on with this magnitude that we know now. On the other side, I think this movie is still very important because it shows the different harms that are driven by a policy. I mean, I want to be understood very well. There is a harm of drug consumption. It's not a good idea to consume drugs. It's clear it's not a good idea to consume in an abusive form alcohol, tobacco, and so on. But the harm of the consumption is, on one side, not automatically a harm touching everybody. I mean, there is also a way to consume in a more or less reasonable way some of the substances that are now illicit. And the way we answer, or the authorities answer to this kind of consumption, is driving the people into a less rational and reasonable consumption. And it is pushing the people inside a consumption that is harmful not only for the substance, but for the marginalization, for the way the consumption takes place, for exchange of syringes, for people who are injecting drugs, for the consequences on the possibilities for these people to find a way to be active in the society, to find a way to be professionally active, and so on. So, I mean, there is a real harm, a real policy-driven harm also linked with the issue of the drugs consumption, and I think we have to face it and to look if there are better solutions to deal with this. The second thing I want to say is we cannot look, we have to accept the challenging, corrupting, violence power of the criminal organization. Speaking about regulation, speaking about new solution, has nothing to do with accepting the power taken by a criminal organization. And we are in the Commission very concerned about the extension of the power of criminal organization in the last 30 years and the spread of their power worldwide. I mean, there is a nice picture, or not nice picture in the movie, where you see really that like une araignée, how do you say une araignée? I mean, this animal who is making such... A spider. The whole world is under the power of criminal organization. Our Commission has a little sister now in West Africa, for instance, that is really looking and very concerned about the situation in a new country which is now a hub for drug and a hub interesting for the consumer of Europe, and which should interest European authorities in order to help also these countries to find a smart drug policy. So it's not a matter of not collaborating internationally to be smart in trying to solve the drug problems and to fight against criminal organization. On the contrary, it's really the necessity now not only to break the taboo, but to leave the countries experiment new models in public health. And that's clear, and that's the reason why I am a movie star, as you say, because in Switzerland we had the opportunity to experiment with scientific monitoring some new approaches, but other countries can do the same and look for other solutions that should be shared with everybody so that the result can bring us either to adopt them or to refuse them. So this is the need we have now. We need new models in the public health, but also in the reglementation or the control of the market. And I am very thankful to Uruguay, for instance. I am very thankful to Portugal and to other countries, the Czech Republic, who are looking how to decriminalize, how to control the market, how to different models of new law enforcement. Controlling a market is not renouncing of the rule of law and the possibility really to to control the thing. At the contrary, I am living in Geneva in a neighborhood where the deal is everywhere. I must say a liberalized market such as this one is a rarity. Generally, the control is better. The control is better on food. The control is better on tobacco. The control is better on alcohol. It is better on medicine. But in the streets where I am living, there is no control at all. It's a free market. It's a self-service, and this has to be changed. So our call, but we have to go further in a serious proposals of different and analysis of different models. Our call now is to say, yes, we cannot leave these substances in the hand of criminals. We have to take over this responsibility, we as states, we as communities, and we have to control the drug market. So that is now our message and our aim, and the international discussion in the UN, in the bodies in Vienna who are in charge with the implementation of the convention has now the task, I think, to give the countries the possibilities to explore these new ways. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ruth. And moving straight on from the perspective of a policymaker to the perspective of a scientist, we have Val Curran with us from University College London. Over to you, Val.
Okay. All right, so I'm a scientist. I'm not a policy maker, so forgive me. I'm going to talk about how can science help inform drug policy, and I hope to reiterate some of what Ruth has just been saying about what happens to the science of drugs when it's left to criminal gangs.
Give a sign to this guy.
Oh, can I not just change it here? No. Oh, okay. I'll have to. I go quite fast, yeah. Okay. All right. Well, all the drugs we're talking about act on the brain. The brain is the main target of all recreational drugs, and understanding drugs and their effects on our brains and how we behave is critical to developing treatment for people with drug problems and preventing young children developing problems. It gives us a better understanding of how to reduce the harms of drugs, both to the user and to society. And I think what I understand about drug policy are those two things are central to drug policy, reducing harms. So in 15 minutes, I'm trying to give you an idea, taking an example of the world's most popular illicit drug, cannabis. To give you a flavour of new findings on this drug, both in terms of its harms and in terms of its very exciting medical use. And if I have time at the end, I want to present what we've been doing in the UK with David Nutt on the Independent Scientific Committee on Drugs, trying to rank all abused drugs on a continuum, which we hope will have direct implications for drug policy in many different countries. Talking of cannabis, most people who use cannabis actually use without having any negative effects at all. Queen Victoria used cannabis throughout her long, long reign in the UK. Her GP prescribed her tincture of cannabis. She used it for her period pains and for all her childbirth. The young man with the red circle there is our Prime Minister, David Cameron, who got caught buying cannabis when he was at school in Slough with 7 other people. The 7 others got thrown out of Eton, thrown out of the school. David Cameron was made to spend 2 weeks copying out Latin poetry. How history would have been different if he'd have been thrown out then. And then, of course, we have the famous pot smoker Barack Obama, who only in January said that I don't think cannabis is more dangerous than alcohol. So most people who do smoke cannabis actually go on to have fairly important jobs, at least don't end up in prison. But there are harms with cannabis, and the 3 main ones are in terms of mental health: psychosis, addiction, and memory impairment. Psychosis, we know that long-term use of cannabis actually doubles a young person's risk of developing a psychotic disorder like schizophrenia if they're vulnerable. Sorry, can you go back? If they're vulnerable for other reasons, genetic reasons, and reasons in terms of their childhood. And very importantly, it leads to onset of schizophrenia 2 or 3 years earlier than it would have happened if they had not used cannabis. Memory impairment, anyone who smoked cannabis would be familiar with that. We know exactly how it works in the brain. We have cannabis receptors very densely in that blue area of the brain, which is the hippocampus, the centre of memory. But the long-term effects of cannabis on memory are inconsistent, and it's not completely clear that it will impinge on people's performance long-term. Certainly while you're smoking cannabis, young children at school and at college will be experiencing problems learning. But the most extraordinary thing to me that's happened in the last few years is addiction. When I was at university, when there were still dinosaurs around, there were hardly any people who were addicted to cannabis. This is something that's happened in the last few years. Of the 180 million users worldwide, about 11% fulfill all clinical criteria for addiction. And in Europe, this is recent data that's come out from ECMDDA and other organisations, 1% of all adults and nearly 2% of 14 to 7-year-old children are addicted. And it's become cannabis addictions the reason for new referrals for drug treatment in 28% of all cases in Europe now. So it's second only to heroin at 41%. This is an extraordinary change. Why has this happened? Well, cannabis isn't one drug. People talk about cannabis as that's it. But it's not. It's a very, very complicated plant, and it contains over 100 unique ingredients that we call cannabinoids. Okay. The 2 most prominent ones are THC, and that's what makes people stoned. It's why they smoke it. But there's a very important other ingredient called CBD, or cannabidiol. And in a way, these 2 compounds are like the yin and yang in cannabis. THC makes you anxious, it produces psychotic effects, it impairs memory. CBD does the opposite, reduces anxiety, it has antipsychotic effects, even some effectiveness as a treatment in schizophrenia. It improves learning and it blocks the THC memory loss. In the brain, they have opposite effects on our cannabis receptors. So we were wondering, is part of this huge increase in addiction to do with the fact of CBD not being present? We wanted to know if CBD can protect cannabis users against the harmful effects of THC. Now, if I was doing this with any legal drug, what I would do is do a clinical trial, a randomized clinical trial. So I'd give a third of people cannabis with both THC and CBD, 4 weeks, a third with THC only for 4 weeks, and a third an inactive placebo. And I'd compare them before, then at 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks. I can't do that because it's illegal. So I have to find clever ways around it. Hair is a way we've found. Your hair grows 1 centimetre a month, and inside your hair there's a shaft which keeps a record very nicely of all the drugs you've used. Okay? So we can have hair analysed, so each month representing 1 centimetre, and you can see someone's intake over a year depending on how long their hair is. So for you, that'd be about 2 months, I could tell. And we got people together. We found that in 20 young people's hair, there was only THC. It should be about 40 people had both CBD and THC in their hair, and the majority actually had neither, 86. And all these people, we did a standard clinical assessment of psychosis, which is called the O-Life. And what we found was that the red curve, the red bar, is those who only had THC. They were experiencing much more of the positive symptoms of schizophrenia at a subclinical level than either of the other two. So, to put it in other words, if you had no cannabinoids in your hair, you were fine. If you had THC only, you had higher levels of hallucinations and delusions. But if you had both THC and CBD, you were absolutely fine as well. So this suggests to us that CBD can protect you against the harmful effects of THC. We then went on to do a naturalistic study with a bigger group, 600 young people, 16 to 23-year-olds. We can't work with less than 16-year-olds because they have to ask their parents to consent to them taking part in research. And you can imagine saying, Mum and Dad, I'm only 13, but I smoke cannabis, can I do research? It doesn't work. So we had them smoke their own cannabis, and these people would all use for a year. And we tested them on one day when they were intoxicated with their own cannabis, another day when sober, and the half the group we tested the other way round. And we assessed them on the main harms of cannabis, and we also took a sample of the cannabis they'd actually smoked and got it analysed for CBD and THC, and looked at CBD and THC in lots of other biological samples. So just to give you some examples, what we found with memory function is when people, the red bar again is the bar where there's no CBD, so it's skunk type cannabis. The green bar is where the cannabis is high in CBD. So when these two groups were not intoxicated, they were fine, there was no difference. But when they were intoxicated, the people who were having skunk, THC without CBD, showed a severe impairment of memory. The people with CBD in their cannabis were absolutely fine again. Another thing that drugs do, all sorts of drugs, if you're addicted, it attracts your attention towards drugs in the environment. So an alcoholic will go down a supermarket lane and see the alcohol before seeing anything else. The same with somebody who might be addicted to cannabis. And okay, it's fine. Again, if the person has CBD in their cannabis, that effect disappeared. So that's a big, strong indication of addiction, that again, CBD was protecting people against becoming addicted to cannabis. We also found those who preferred skunk, the high THC, low CBD varieties, of the 600, there were significantly more cannabis-addicted people to skunk. They smoked 3.5 grams much faster. They craved cannabis more when they were sober. And they had more THC and no CBD, both in their cannabis and in their hair. So what's happening? It seems to be that CBD, over the past 10 years, has been vanishing from cannabis in Europe. These are UK figures. 2002, 30% of cannabis was skunk type with no CBD. It increased 3 years later to 55%, and then again to 80%. In our sample of 600 young people, 80% were using skunk. So what's happening over time is that CBD is being taken away from cannabis. Why is this? Well, certainly in the UK, and I'm just back from Denmark and it's happening there as well, is that most cannabis is being grown intensively in illegal farms in the UK and in Denmark. This is mostly by Vietnamese gangs. And they're growing it indoors so they can't be detected as easily by the police. And what they do is they maximize the THC content, so it's really, really strong. But because they grow it under 24-hour lighting, it destroys the CBD in the plant. So this is what's been happening over the last 10 years. This is why we're facing an enormous change in cannabis addiction. In Colorado, it makes me laugh because their recreational marijuana, they're selling, it looks like a sweet shop. You go in there and you see there's chocolate truffles with THC in, but they're not putting any CBD in. So this is a bit like Alka-Pops. Young kids will be seeing cannabis in chocolates, not knowing that they should be having CBD as well as THC, and they shouldn't really be having anything before they're adults, because it affects the plasticity in the brain, which develops hugely during puberty and adolescence. But it's irresponsible of Colorado to sell things like this without balancing the number of the cannabinoids in it. Medical marijuana, has been mentioned, is now available in an enormous number of countries, and 20 of the US states now allow it. And the main symptoms it's being prescribed for are pain, anxiety, sleep. And in California, we're working with one clinic there. They've discovered a new psychiatric disorder, which is called writer's block. You can actually get a prescription from your doctor for writer's block. The cannabis plant, I've only talked about THC and CBD, but there are more than 100 other cannabinoids in the plant. We know that potentially, therefore, it's the most fantastic source of medicines. Okay, I meant to have a slide in it, got lost, about the medical use. Now, these cannabinoids, THC and CBD, are now being used throughout Europe, Australia, and Canada for multiple sclerosis. They help people with multiple sclerosis not have these kind of reflex actions that stop them sleeping. THC on its own is used for nausea associated with radiotherapy, and now just started in 15 clinical sites in the States. CBD is being used for childhood severe forms of epilepsy. These are only just beginning. There's a trial been done in Germany last year showing that CBD helps in schizophrenia. So there are lots of potential medical uses of this plant that we should really build on. I just wanted to end up quickly in 5 minutes talking about drugs as a whole, the overall harms of drugs. That's something that Professor David Nutt's been looking at as part of the Independent Scientific Committee on Drugs. And what this has done over the last few years is to rate 20 of the most commonly used recreational drugs all together. Difficult exercise. And I know it's a bit difficult to see, but they've established a network of harms, not only to the self, to the person using the drug, but harms to society, harms to other people. And Okay. And the first paper that came out in The Lancet in 2010. And as you see, alcohol actually turned out, in terms of harms to self, total harms to self and others, has actually been more damaging than many of the illicit drugs. I mean, that will make sense to a lot of you because you know of all the side effects in terms of social effects of alcohol, as well as increased liver problems. I mean, liver disease is the one increasing disease at the moment in the Western world, much more than anything else. And then just here in Brussels a few months ago, we all met to get a European view on this. So there were 19 different European countries who came together, drug experts from all those fields, often 2 or 3 from each country. And we did the same ranking exercise again to try and get a European-wide view. And actually what we found is very, very similar to what had been found previously. Again, alcohol came up as number 1, heroin as number 2. We think that these rankings in terms of harms to users and harms to others might be useful in policy, because there was no relation at all between the rankings of the drugs by the experts and where those drugs sit in the legal system of any European country. No correspondence at all, suggesting that the classification of drugs bears no relation to actual harms of drugs. So that, starting with the Nostell and the Lancet, Van Amsterdam in the Netherlands has done a similar thing, again showing similar results. The new EU rankings, again by experts, show similar results. We published later this year. And we've, with my colleague Celia Morgan, done 2 studies now with users involving over 3,000 people using drugs. And we found that drug users agree very strongly with the experts, and again, no relation to any legal restrictions on drugs. So to conclude, I'm aware that to date drug policy has not been helped much by findings from drug science, and that's partly because most drug policies have existed for decades in most countries, whereas much of drug science is very new. At the same time, we think that drug science is an important, if changing, because the drug world changes all the time. We've got the new psychoactives coming in, we've got different kinds of cannabis. It's a changing evidence base, but it's still an important evidence base which we think policy should take account of. And finally, I also want to make a plea as a scientist, is that the legal status of a drug can often restrict the amount of research we can do on it. Okay, so thank you. The website there is Drug Science and has masses of information about drugs.
Thank you very much, Val, and an accommodation and recommendation to that particular website. In the policy debate, it's very important that people read and reflect on the science, which is a good introduction also to our next speaker, who's Wolfgang Gotz from the European Monitoring Centre on Drugs and Drug Addiction. And certainly in European debates and between member states and the scientific community, the work of this centre is absolutely crucial. So, Wolfgang, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. I think we have heard some really interesting arguments now from the 2 previous speakers, and they were very, very different statements we have heard, but those very interesting, and I think this alone would already give us quite a lot of material for discussion. I'm now coming into this debate again at a different angle, because as director, Mike said it, of an EU agency that provides evidence, I cannot participate actively in any policy debate. But what I can is I can contribute by bringing in my experience as an observer of drug policy developments at national, at national and at international levels, and this over the last 2 decades. Many of you know, I imagine at least, that the EMCDDA does not have in its mandate the competence to recommend policy options or even to evaluate policies. In fact, we are a technical, scientific-driven monitoring center which continuously feeds the EU member states and the EU decision-making processes with objective, reliable, non-partisan information on all aspects of the drugs phenomenon. And during these years at the EMCDDA, I have learned two important lessons, which I would like to share with you here today. I think they will both be important in the years to come. First, the central role Europe plays in promoting drug policies that are based on fundamental values and principles, on values and principles such as respect for human dignity and the promotion of public health. And second, the value and the power of evidence, or let's call it objective and reliable information, when it comes to influencing or to shaping policy decisions. Let me start with the role of Europe. When looking at the European drug situation and the developments in European drug policies, we can see the situation in very different ways. Some of us see the glass half empty, others are sure it's half full. I must say I tend to believe in the half full argument. Because when we look at the overall situation in the European Union, we can see positive developments in relation to more established drugs, such as fewer new users of heroin, less injecting, and declining use of cannabis and cocaine in some countries. At political level, in Europe, we see increased consensus on the already mentioned basic principles in the drugs field, and also increased willingness to consider the evidence of what constitutes effective action. In my opinion, this development is to a certain extent rooted in national and EU investments in the European Monitoring Centre for Drugs and Drug Addiction and in its network of national focal points. National focal points are national scientifically driven monitoring centres. Since the early 90s, and this was the time when the first EU strategies were put in place, when the EMCDDA was created, the discussion at EU level have slowly but steadily developed from ideological confrontations to straightforward discussions based on evidence. And I could see that these developments in our management board. And we have at least 2 former members of our management board, or 3 here in the room. And when looking at the contents of European drug policies at EU and national levels, we observe that they are comprehensive and balanced, and that they acknowledge the importance of both drug supply and drug demand reduction interventions in response to the problem. Scientific knowledge is used to define the contents of the policies and to develop capacities to react rapidly to new substances or new trends in drug use. And today, European drug policies are generally realistic and pragmatic, focusing on real problems and solutions rather than on theoretical and ideological debates. Let me give you an example here, and I'm sure many will not like it. In the EU, the combination of comprehensive demand reduction policies and supply-side actions implemented at country and EU level has resulted in a decline of heroin problems across Europe. For me, that's quite a good rebuttal to those who say that current drug policies have no impact. At global level, the EU approach, which is reflected in the EU drug strategy, proposes one of the most humane, balanced and realistic drug policies in the world. There might still be a lot to do, but we cannot ignore that the European Union is the only region in the world explicitly referring to risk and harm reduction as one of its comprehensive and integrated drug demand reduction approach elements. Furthermore, the European Union is the only region promoting education, treatment, rehabilitation and social reintegration alternatives, and this just not to prison, but also to coercive sanctions for drug-using offenders. And it is the only region in the world with a strategy that explicitly mentions evidence as a constitutive element of its approach to drugs. If you look around, Europe's primacy in promoting better health and protecting human rights in the drugs field is evident. Let's look, for example, at the 5 main red lines that the EU is currently discussing, trying to include in the text for the joint ministerial statement at the CND, where the high-level meeting takes place next week. There are respect for the international conventions, inclusion of the concept of risk and harm reduction, involvement of civil society in drug policy, a statement against the death penalty, and the EU approach to alternative development. However, despite these encouraging developments at policy level, we should not lose sight of the current drug problems we have in Europe. And I think it is here where one could start thinking about the glass being half empty. Nowadays, stimulants, including cocaine and synthetic substances, are more important players in the European drug scene. Patterns of drug use have become more fluid, and consumers often use multiple substances, or they substitute one drug for another. And all this depending on availability, price, or perceived quality. New drugs, our so-called legal highs, are perhaps one of the most challenging areas for drug policy today. They have been brought onto the market in sophisticated new ways and with alarming speed. 81 new substances were notified in 2013 to the early warning system that we are running together with Europol. These are 5 times more than 5 years ago and 11 times more than 10 years ago. And we have now 350 substances on our monitoring radar which were notified to us since 2005, and 75% of these 350 have been detected in the last 4 years. When looking at these glass half-empty arguments, we should also not forget that improvements in social and health responses to drug use must continue if we want to treat more drug users with better results and help them to be socially reintegrated, and this in times where most health and social affairs budgets are under pressure. Let me now continue with the importance of evidence in the European Union and the way in which, over the years, available scientific evidence has helped shape the responses to drugs problems and increase the availability of active interventions. Look, for instance, at substitution treatment. Critics would say that replacing one drug with another should not be allowed. And we all know that in countries such as Russia, substitution treatment is quite simply forbidden. In 2001, we had in Europe, in the European Union, 70,000 problem drug users receiving opioid substitution treatment, and today there are more than 750,000 of them. Substitution treatment is available in all EU member states, and the EU promotes this as among third countries as best practice. This has happened because evidence has shown that there are beneficial effects of substitution treatment on opioid addicts, resulting in an improved state of health and lower mortality, as well as in a reduction of criminal behavior. The same can be said for needle and syringe programs. Critics would argue that these programs incite injecting or increase the frequency of injecting. This was, by the way, the reason why, before the Obama administration, it was not possible in the US to allocate federal funds to needle exchange programs. But there is no evidence for all this. Rather, evidence has shown that needle exchange programs reduce injecting risk behaviors, and in particular HIV and HCV transmission. Needle and syringe programs are today publicly funded and implemented in all 28 EU member states. It is also thanks to evidence that Portugal, it was mentioned already, has been able to maintain its health-oriented drug policy despite several government changes from left to right and right to left several times, and despite the false prediction that Portugal would become a destination for drug tourists. And today, the Portuguese model has become some kind of a trademark, of a global trademark even. In the European Union, the availability of evidence, the sharing of best practice, and the regular debate among EU member states have enabled decision makers to further develop drugs policy and to try out new interventions with more confidence. A few years ago, nobody would have expected to have needle exchange or methadone treatment available in Cyprus, for example, or a consumption room opened in Denmark. It was not imaginable a few years ago, but today all this has become reality. Now we see new cannabis legislation. It was mentioned also already, and also in the movie, in the film, in Colorado, Washington State, and Uruguay. To be fully accepted and maintained, these policies and legislations, which defy the global established system, need to show positive results through reliable and impartial monitoring and evaluation. Ladies and gentlemen, to conclude, I would like to stress that over the last 2 decades in the EU we have made considerable progress in the field of illicit drugs. This is, in my opinion, one of the main reasons why EU member states are currently not looking at major revisions to the global system. As I have already said, the EU drug problem is quite stable and improving in some areas, but even earlier, when the situation was still worsening, drug problems were never high up on the agenda of most politicians. And this despite the fact that public opinion has always attached great importance to illicit drugs. In the past, progress has often been triggered by worrying developments, such as the heroin epidemics in the 80s, mainly in Europe, and the HIV problem, which, among other things, by the way, were also the reason for creating the EMCDDA. And currently, most politicians are only interested in new psychoactive substances. That is all more reason why I'm glad to be here today, and I see with forward-looking policymakers who are not just waiting for the next crisis to discuss a new approach. When talking about the European drug policy for the 21st century, we should, in my opinion, not just focus on the global system. I believe that within the EU, there is also much room for further progress. We need to continue promoting our evidence-based approach, which, in a way, is the backbone of our common strategy. And in particular, at times when national decision makers are often faced with difficult choices, reduced funds, and competing priorities, it is extremely important that wise investments are made in the illicit drugs area. Investments based on a sound understanding of the problem and of the measures that will deliver the greatest benefits. Internationally, I wish the EU would play a much stronger role in the global debate in promoting the EU approach outside Europe. But I think that the European Union and its member states lack a common international vision in the field of drugs, and in particular, a strategy for building alliances. Building alliances should be a permanent task, and it should be based on building relations and trust. In this context, scientific cooperation and the exchange of methodologies and information are widely underused instruments. And I'm saying this all the time at Commission, Council, Parliament level, and I never received any positive reply on that. Once again, I'm deeply convinced that to have a more effective drug policy approach in the future, we need even more faith in evidence in Europe and more Europe internationally. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Wolfgang, and thank you to speakers so far for getting us back onto our time schedule. I now pass over to Paola Tardioli Schiavo from the European Commission. Paola.
I like the way my name is pronounced. It's always very different. Recently I've been called Tardelli, like a football player, which was very good. Thank you very much. I will be very brief because, first of all, it's late, and then a lot has been said already. I don't want to be repetitive and say the same thing. I try to be original. I thank very much Wolfgang for having expressed a few concepts that I also, from his personal point of view, that I also agree with. We are always, I cannot say attacked, but criticized not to be brave, which maybe is true, because maybe more things can be done. But believe me, in the circumstances where the European policy develops, we really do a lot. I think that everybody has to understand that drugs policy is not something which is in the hands of the European Union as such. Drugs policy is in the hands of 28 member states that constitute a range of opposite positions, going from a very traditional approach to more liberal approach. and all the nuances between that. So, and they are the responsible bodies. I mean, the create and develop the policy is in their hands. So why we have been successful? I would say, I don't know if we have been successful using the indicators, the concrete indicators of, let's say, reducing drugs or reducing the harms and so on. The MCDDA tells us that we have been successful in that, or at least in part of that. I think we have been successful from a policy point of view, because we have been able to make member states so different between them, converging in a set of important principles. The principles that have been enumerated already by the MCDDA, but I like to repeat. First of all, the idea that the drug is a health question, preliminarily. This is what we think in Europe, and I think that even the most traditional, let me use this term, countries already understand this issue. Secondly, that in this policy, as in all the other policies that the European Union treats in one way or the other, human rights and fundamental rights are in the center of our preoccupation. The European Union is founded on that principles, so the European Union defends that principles in every circumstances and every place, and for every kind of policy we are called to work. So the respect of human rights and all that is a founding principle of our drug policies, a policy as of all other policies of the European Union. Then the balanced approach. It has been said, the balanced approach, you know better than me what is it. I mean, the idea that the supply reduction interventions have the same dignity and the same importance that demand reduction interventions. Personally, I think that the last are even more important, but we put them in the same balance. I mean, they are both important. Efforts should be equilibrated in one side and the other. Evidence-based, I will not spend any more words on that, but it is true. I mean, we try to base our policy choices on evidences. Involvement of civil society, this is also true. We have we are trying to have a sort of institutional dialogue with the European civil society. Sometimes it's successful, sometimes it's not, but can be improved. But we try. I mean, we do consider we are functional. We do consider that the civil society, that we have a lot to learn from them. So we involve them. The importance of the international relations, the importance of working with third countries. In Europe, we have bypassed, I would say, the idea of the countries that produce, countries that consume, countries that are transit place where drugs is smuggled. We know perfectly that drugs nowadays is produced in other countries that traditionally they didn't. We know that it's consumed in countries that traditionally have been producers. The most clear example is Brazil. Brazil is the second country in the world consuming cocaine after the United States, which means that all this is obsolete, which means that Europe goes toward member states, the third countries and third regions with I would say, an humble approach of we dialogue as equally interested to achieve the same result, which is something, because I remember a few years ago when I started in this field, I remember that the biggest critic that we had was from Colombia, other Latin American countries, was, we produce because you use that. And during the years, they are not saying that anymore, which means that these differences are disappearing. Let me say that this strategy that Wolfgang Goltz was mentioning is the frame of the European policy. It has built on what it has been done before, but also has ameliorated the picture respect to the strategy that we had before. For instance, in this strategy, we use the term risk and harm reduction. We use harm reduction, which is not explicitly used before. You can think that everything I'm saying is obvious, that the harms should be reduced, that the people should be protected, that the rights should be respected, and so on. So what is Europe doing? I mean, nothing very particularly sexy. I mean, that we are doing what is logically has to be done. This is not true. And what is going on now in the international arena in Vienna is something which gives us exactly the picture of the fact that other countries and regions in the world are very far from applying these principles that seems to be basic. If I tell you that the European Union has to fight in Vienna to see the respect of human rights mentioned and to see the absurdity of death penalty used in crimes linked to drug mentioned in the documents. I mean, in Europe we say death penalty. What are you talking about? Are you crazy? No, in some part of the world they still believe that death penalty should be a concept first, and then a concept applying to drugs situations. So this just to tell you that what we are doing with enormous efforts, because believe me, it's not easy to find consensus between so different positions we have in Europe. It is something that may be not revolutionary, but certainly quite good, and we must continue in this way. I hope I've not been too long.
Well, thank you very much, Paola, and thank you to all the speakers. As you can hear, you've seen a film that shows us why drug policy reform is firmly on the agenda, and you've heard from all the speakers the complexity of the issue. There are no simple answers here. If there were, then they would have been provided. But there is an increasing feeling that historical approaches are not having sufficient impact. Whatever you think of our different policies, we are not having sufficient impact as governments and international community. Also, that the status quo is not sustainable. Now, that is a less consensus position, but from our perspective, International Drug Policy Consortium, we have real concerns that it's not going to be possible to continue with current frameworks and current policies, because things in the outside world, with the drug markets and political realities, are going to change things for us. So 3 items we always bring policymakers' attention to. First of all, there is a rapidly diversifying global drug market. It's not as simple as it used to be. There are many more substances, as a couple of the speakers have said. There are many more ways in which they are produced and distributed around the world, and the patterns of consumption are changing very rapidly. And these realities of the changing drug markets are often beyond the ability of governments to react quickly enough and to be able to influence. The second reason why reform needs to be considered is that, if you like, our plan A, our preferred model of response to drug problems, which did resolve around prioritization of eradication of production, eradication of crops, physically preventing the distribution of the drugs we were most worried about, and punishing people for their use and possession of those drugs. Those primary policies, which I agree from many of the speakers, have never really been or have not for a long time been the priority in Europe, but they are generally the underpinning of the global approaches. They have not really been achieving the objectives objectives they set for themselves, which is to reduce and eventually eradicate the supply and demand for drugs. And the third reason why there is a political reality why the status quo needs to be very carefully discussed and looked at is that there are increasing numbers of defections from the agreed framework. Now, a lot of those defections have been happening for a long time at local level amongst citizens and communities, not complying with the international frameworks, but increasingly those defections are coming from local and national governments. And I think it's been mentioned tonight already, and it is very present that we have had 2 direct defections by member states from the international conventions. The first one was a procedural one pursued by Bolivia over the last couple of years. They wanted to change the position of coca leaf within the convention, and when they couldn't persuade their international partners, they stepped out of the international agreements and then stepped back in with a reservation. Don't ask me to explain the procedure, but they did it. The second defection has been mentioned tonight is Uruguay. A country has said, no, we will, with cannabis, we will not continue to implement the international conventions. We will manage a state-run regulated cannabis market. And as you've heard, there are also 2 what you might call local administrations, but in America, local is very big, state administration in America who are doing versions of the same thing. So there are defections happening now, some of which are from national governments. We predict, and we don't know how this will play out, but there will be more defections in the coming year. In the coming years. So the international policymakers have a real problem, is they can't sit still and watch this. They have to find a way of handling these realities. As you know, as most of you will know, the international community is meeting next week in Vienna, which is the home of the United Nations drug control institutions, to announce a review of progress in international drug control since 2009. It's what we call a midterm review of a 10-year strategy. There was a lot of diplomatic activity that generally the European Union has been a good player in, a positive player in, for the reasons Paula and Wolfgang have spoken to us. But there is very little sign of much agreement globally on exactly what should be done about this inability to stick with the status quo. So there's going to be a very thin agreement next week, and it's not going to resolve these big global political challenges that are facing people over a number of years. And as Ruth said in her presentation, there is a United Nations General Assembly meeting in 2 years' time that is very in the forefront of people's minds about, are we going to be able over the next 2 years to move from the very fragmented position, very different approaches to this problem by different countries. Are we going to be able to find some sort of renewed and effective and sustainable consensus in the next 2 years? And it's going to be very difficult, because we're watching these UN debates, and we are seeing that there are very, very different attitudes to this reality. There are countries who react to this reality by saying we need to repress harder. We need to have tougher policies. We need to use the death penalty. We need to have stronger law enforcement. We need bigger militaries, and we need to beat the traffickers and beat the users. And there are many countries who still hold this position. I won't list them. There are what I would call the countries that have quite broad, sophisticated debates going on already. And they are mainly focusing, I would say, on incremental steps for better health policy, better cohesion, better approaches to the law, better community-based approaches. And that broadly, I would agree, is the European position. The European countries broadly are saying we can make progress within our current frameworks, we can be better, we can improve health, we can improve the outcomes. And then there are groups that are saying we should be considering significant reform towards radically new approaches. And that's not just the countries like Uruguay are saying forget the conventions, and that's not what they are saying, but they are working outside the conventions. There are other models such as the New Zealand model, is saying, no, work within the conventions, but let's take a new approach to new substances. Let's not just try to ban them and add them to our list of banned substances. Let's take another approach by licensing them and trying to keep them safe for consumers. So there are all sorts of debates going around the world, but we are a long, long way from a consensus of what we should do about the current drug problems. So, okay, with that as information for you or stimulation for you to ask questions, I'm really hoping, I know all the panel are hoping that we can use our last half an hour for some interaction with the audience. So I hope you are suitably stimulated to ask questions. In the usual fashion, please raise your hand and I'll indicate when it's time for your question. And when you start your question, give your name and, if you are comfortable, give your affiliation as well. So over to you. Please let me know if you want to ask a question.
Okay, yes, I'm Dr. Peter Rice. I'm a psychiatrist from the University of Dundee in Scotland and chairman of Scottish Health Action on Alcohol Problems. I'd like to make a point and ask a question arising from that. My point is that the regulation of substances is a never-ending process. I was teaching medical students at the University of Dundee on Monday, and they were astonished when I was speaking about the Tobacco Products Directive that the tobacco industry still has a voice in the Commission and in Member States and still has an influence. So after 30 years of seeming to be out in the wilderness, they're still effective. In Scotland, as part of the United Kingdom, we put forward a modest proposal on alcohol pricing, and the response of the alcohol industry has been as if we've said we're going to come and steal their wallets. There are member states that are objecting to our local measure because of the international nature of the alcohol industry. And so my point is that for the legal substances we have, the task of regulation doesn't end and it continues. But I think leading on from that point, Wolfgang used the phrase of the need for a common international vision. And I'd like to ask, I think Ruth Dreyfus might be the best place to answer this. Do you think that there's the prospect of a common international vision for regulation? Do you think that would be desirable or possible? Or if we do move to a deregulation, to a process of legalisation but regulation, do you think we will end up with member states having very different policies as they have, for instance, on alcohol, or do you think it's desirable for there to be a more common international vision?
It's a difficult question, and I think it's not an absolutely timely question because now we are really in a situation where we have to look for models of regulation and to experiment them, and really to look also what are the consequences of these different models in terms of number of consumers, in terms of effect on the, is it possible for some substances to take over all the market, or what is the remaining market in criminal hands, and so on. So, I mean, there are different models, and I am calling, and the Commission is mainly calling for allowing and encouraging such kind of serious researches, so in order to know what works and what doesn't work. And this is a long process. I mean, it's not something you can do from one day to the other. For instance, just to take one example, Switzerland is known for having introduced heroin prescription, medical prescription for opiate-dependent people. We had 5 years of monitoring, 5 years of discussing the results of this experience, and I think 5 years of changing the law to put it as a regular mean for substitution therapy. So, I mean, my experience is that it is a long process, but what is important is really to begin and to accept that this is I would say, a service given by Uruguay, by Colorado, by other states who will find new solutions, by Spain with the Cannabis Social Club. But I must say cannabis is the easiest problem, I think, in the field of drugs, that we will receive all these results. So will it be once a time where everybody has the same attitude and the same model of regulation? I would say probably not, because it will really depend on the general position on market regulation, on control in all other substances and activities. And you know that we have very different models of how far the state has to interfere, how far the enterprise has to take responsibility, and so on. So no, I don't think that we will reach one model, but I think what is important is that in the next 10 years, several models are really experimented and watched by the whole community and published in their results.
Just to pick up on that, the dilemma, which I'm sure you're referring to, is that there is very strong and varied and heartfelt opinions of the benefit or otherwise of regulated models. But of course, they are all opinions until there's empirical research. And of course, because we have run a globally system with every country signed up to it, we don't have any empirical models to review, certainly in the modern age. That's the dilemma of this problem. And I think something Wolfgang said in his speech, I don't know if you're applying it specifically to this cannabis regulation, but the importance of structured, unbiased evaluation of policies is so important in this phase. And it's so important of governments to commit themselves to first commissioning that work, and second of all, listening to it. Interesting question, Wolfgang. With Colorado, Washington, and Uruguay, we now have these laboratories. You must have looked at the evaluation plans for these initiatives. Are you reassured or worried?
Thanks, Mike. No, but I also think it's a long way to go, and I think at the level of the UN member states, I think finding a majority for changing conventions is not there. The number of defections has not reached a critical mass. But I think so organizations like the Global Commission on Drugs Policy and the NGO world, I think, is really driving the discussion for the moment. That's not so much countries, a few countries mentioned. As regards, absolutely right, and I said it already, I think it's now really, there's a need for evaluation, for monitoring what's going on in these different models. And in the cannabis world, we have mentioned the three, and I must say, what I see for the moment is that Uruguay, which, by the way, is very much linked to the current president, let's see what will be after the elections, and Washington State, they are very much inspired by the tobacco model, and I think that is something that is understandable for people, makes a lot of sense, and is also what Dreyfus mentioned in the movie already and earlier. But I would nobody advise to buy shares from one of these new companies in Colorado. I think what they are doing could even be dangerous and could fail in the end, because they make it a totally free market, which you don't have in anything else as just in cannabis there. And but let's see, let's follow. Obviously, we follow it very closely, but we don't have a mandate and we don't have the resources to follow it on a daily basis. Obviously. Thanks.
I would like to just ask something that has to do with the next week and the position of the EU in there. I have the feeling that the EU has a practice and also does a lot of research, evaluation, and so on. And as you demonstrated also here, we actually don't have such a big problem as other countries in the world. And I am asking myself, what is the responsibility of the EU towards, let's say, other parts of the world, Asia or Latin America or whatever. I have the feeling that the EU does not have a real profile in the international discussion. And at least they are not so militant as they had to be, because they can speak from their own practice. Why is that not happening? From what I hear now is that the resolution or the statement of the ministers will be again a paper without real saying something to the world. And the EU is part of it. What are the reasons that we are not so tough, let's say, pushing our own ideas? And others who are on the conservative side, they always say, this is our red line, we cannot agree with this. But Europe could also say that, at least if they don't say it altogether. Most of the countries are in favor of certain policies, and they could do it also. What will be the danger to take such an attitude than go again with a consensus and make compromises?
Okay, I think, Paola, that's you.
Let me, because you said something at the beginning which brings me to give you a double answer. The first answer, I'm speaking also under control of my colleague of the EIS there, is that internationally it is not true that the European Union has not been influential. I think that I would say when we did the evaluation, the external evaluation of our strategy, one of the main points of force of importance that this strategy had was exactly the idea that the European Union has been influential in some part of the world. Let me start with the countries that are more interested, have a more active interest in being similar to the European Union, means the candidate countries, but also the countries surrounding the EU, the neighbours countries. So the evaluation that we did before engaging in a new strategy showed that actually the European Union has been quite successful with third countries in exporting its moderate model. CCD, the situation in Vienna is another story. The situation in Vienna now is that the European Union is member states are converging on a certain number of principles that would like to see recognized in Vienna. At the same time, the member states express the necessity of having something done in Vienna, something which can be as a starting point for further reflection. So we have now these two interests in the balance. From one side, trying not to vanify and jeopardize a process that can lead slowly to some more important success, and to the other side, defending our red lines. To be sincere, I don't know what will be the results of all that in Vienna, but I can tell you two things. That we have been quite better than the last year in organizing ourselves. I mean, I don't know if in Vienna then the country X will say something and the country Y exactly the contrary. I cannot predict that. But on paper, I can say that the European Union has been more effective in trying to speak with one voice in this context. Now, defending the principles that we have until the end, I don't know. I cannot give you an answer. I cannot give you the answer if the European Union can be so strong as Mexico is now to say, look, better no statement than a statement which is not meaningful for us. I cannot give you an answer to that, because this is what member states are actually discussing. They are taking into consideration all options, including one to be vocal also in written on different issues, including the one of the death penalty, which seems absurd, but there are countries that oppose to the mention of death penalty in the papers. Of course, to the mention that death penalty doesn't have to be applied in these cases. So I don't have an answer on that, but yes, I have an answer on the fact that we are ameliorating, which is already something, because I can tell you that with respect to last year, the European Union is acting better with one voice. So it is already something.
Yeah, thanks. I think I can just underline everything that Paula said, and I just wanted to add, we, the agency, we do scientific cooperation with strictly everybody in the world who is competent, or countries that are competent, for sure, with the US, Canada, Australia, and so on top outside the European Union. We do technical cooperation. We have a daily cooperation with CCAT, the drugs agency of the Organization of American States. So all these countries you saw here, we are quite closely involved. We have a neighborhood policy area, Russia, candidate countries. This is daily business for us. We are a small agency, 100 people, but very much linked, I would say, to the rest of the world, and we are very active players in two big commission programs, or commission finance program, commission external action service, commission finance programs in Latin America and in Central Asia. All that is taking place, but what I said earlier, I think there is really a problem in building alliances. In the UN, in the CND that takes place now, there's the high level next week and the big CND the week after. A big part of these meetings are endless discussion about texts for resolutions. And this is word by word, where the European Union wants to have a mentioning of harm reduction, and the Iranian wants to have the heroes mentioned that are killed for fighting drug dealers or something like that. And to bring that together is almost impossible. And my opinion is that this cooperation we are doing, scientists are doing, others are doing at more technical scientific level, that should be much, much more used to build trust, to build alliances, and not go to Vienna then and start, even if the EU member states are together, and then you have to convince the other 150 about something that you bring in Vienna. This has to be a task all throughout the whole year, and you have to build these alliances permanently. And this is what I'm saying. This is something where the European Union is not very good. It is true. The European Union is much more united than it was a few years ago. I mentioned many examples that you find in all member states, which were very much discussed a few years ago. But the building alliances and getting then resolutions through in Vienna is a work of the whole year and cannot just start a few weeks before the meeting. And that is a bit how it takes place. You know, the Horizontal Drugs Group in the Council has just discussed, I think last week, I mentioned these 5 ideas, not banning the death penalty, bringing in again harm and risk reduction and so on. But I think at the European Union we are always starting too late. One of the problems clearly is that it's a member states issue, the power is with the member states, and the possibility of the real European Union bodies, Commission and Parliament, is very limited.
Thank you, Wolfgang. Any other panel members want to respond on this question? Nikos?
I think the main problem is that we don't have one voice. There are 28 countries, and they are not able to coordinate the policy before going to Vienna or somewhere else. And this happens not only concerning the drugs issue or policies, but also in other topics, even social policy. It's a big problem.
And those of you who have observed United Nations diplomatic negotiations, there is never an agreement to start with. So it is what we call in English arm wrestling. You have to negotiate and you have to come to agreements. And it's true that the countries on this issue who maybe will be worried or will oppose a European Union position, they know very well what Nikos just said is the European Union starts with one hand tied behind its back because it needs to have its 28-country agreement before it even arrives at the negotiating table. So it's a very tough ask for our diplomats. The point, I think, not to lose also is what Wolfgang made, is it's much easier to disseminate, and I think this was your question, Thanasis, Europe's knowledge, scientific evidence and power through alliances of best practice and science. It's much easier to do. I'm not saying it's the only thing that should be done, but it's a much easier job than trying to get 200 countries to sign up to a set of words. And I would agree with Wolfgang. We haven't been particularly good at this in this field in Europe over, I think, 10, 20 years. We have been the region of the world that has a lot of the best experiences and diverse knowledge. And I would say it's something to look at there is the historical pattern of European aid, your EU aid to Latin America or Central Asia, is that is tied into the old view. It's changing now, but as traditionally tied into the old view of the reason we give aid to other parts of the world is to stop drugs flowing to our continent. Yeah? That's what we spent most money on as bilateral donors, as an EU donor. And that is changing very slowly. I would like to see the priorities for that aid being very much what Wolfgang just said. Building joint best practice work, joint scientific work. That is a much more useful use of EU aid in this era. At this stage. Frank.
Hello. Sorry. My name is Frederick Polak. I'm a member of NCOD, the European organization. What I cannot understand is that there is no more, movement to change the situation for cannabis in the present, what we know about it. And we heard again from Professor Curran that there is almost, you could say, scientific consensus that the harm caused by cannabis is lower than a lot of the substances that are being allowed, and also of some of the other illicit drugs. And I think it's an incredible scandal that still in almost all countries people have to go to jail for things having to do with cannabis, and that there is no consensus there. It should mean that the defections have, our only hope is that there will be more defections and that the international conventions will turn out to be completely irrelevant in the world as it is. I just heard from my friend Thanasis that the UNODC brought out just recently a sort of a position paper saying, very shortly, that it's not meant as prohibition, and that's all has been understood wrongly. Some sort of turnaround at this moment because they see that the situation is really changing internationally. I find it really incredible. And then we're not yet talking about the more difficult drugs. Of course, the discussion is more complicated with what's generally called the hard drugs. But even there, the discussion should be had. There should be a rational discussion at the top level where really decisions are being made. But the system as it has been built up, it's built up in such a way that it cannot be changed, or you have to get out or to ignore it. Well.
Yes, and just to explain the document that Freek is referring to, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, as part of the preparations of this meeting that is happening over the next 2 weeks, produced a clarification or a guideline of what the United Nations conventions say on punishment or what is possible within the legal treaties. And they emphasized in this document, which is a very different message than has been received from the UN agencies for a long time, but they emphasize in this document that member states can make quite significant changes to their approach to cannabis, particularly, and they can make quite significant moves towards what we call decriminalisation, which is not holding people responsible for or punishing people for possession or consumption, as we've seen is applied in Portugal. So they're emphasising this is entirely possible within the current treaty framework. So that is a significant change. We have a number of problems with that document and its legal correctness, but not on the point you raise. There are some weaknesses in the document, but not on that point. Anybody on the panel want to reflect on what Freek has just raised?
Might also be driven for cannabis by its medical use. At the moment in the UK, we have this bizarre situation where if someone has multiple sclerosis or very bad arthritis and that kind of thing, then if they get caught growing cannabis for their own use, they will actually risk a prison sentence. And also now with parents who want treatment of cannabinoids for epileptic children, they're pushing the boundaries here.
Anybody else on the panel on this point about cannabis? Okay, I'm going to pass to our host, Nikos Chrysogolos, to do some closing comments, but this is your last opportunity to ask a question. Last chance to put a hand up. Gentleman here.
Eric Carlin from Scottish Health Action on Alcohol Problems. I agree with the move towards a public health focused drug policy and to remove kind of the punitive measures that we have, particularly against drug users. I've worked a lot in drug policy and now working in alcohol policy, and with the latter, I'm concerned about and looking at how things actually operate in the EU context, where in relation to strategy, what you're talking about in terms of drug strategy is a far more positive story than what we can talk about in relation to alcohol strategy, where we don't even have an alcohol strategy now because the economic operators have been so powerful that they've blocked that actually happening. Instead of that, what we will have is a pretty weak and ineffective short-term alcohol action plan. I guess I'm just thinking about it, right, given if we do move to this situation where we look at a different system, how do we ensure that the economic operators within that regulated system are controlled and managed in a way that the alcohol and tobacco industries have not been?
I think it raises a very big point that I think was behind one of our earlier questions as well, is if you manage to create some sort of regulated market, the big question is, do you make the problem worse? And one of the big drivers of what may make the problem worse is the interests of commercial organisations that use their lobbying power to undermine any sort of public health control, which is clearly a potential. Anybody on the panel want to solve that one before we go home?
I cannot solve it, but I think you just have two options. One is you have economic operators such as in the tobacco and alcohol industry, and you cannot do anything, just deal with them as you do there. Or you need a state distribution. That's the only. These are the only two options you have in a regulated system. Okay, fortunately for the moment we don't have to deal with the criminal organizations because they are criminals, but they are already there as actors in the field.
If I'm not wrong, I think that the two options are one in Uruguay now, the state distribution, and the other in Colorado. So we have to wait and see what is going on. I mean, to these so different laboratories of experience that we have now in front of us.
Right.
I think Uruguay is more and more complicated. They have three ways in which somebody can obtain. You can grow for yourself, you can be member of a club, and you can go to a pharmacy. So I don't think that should be called state. There's control on the regulation, but it's not all done by the state.
No, that's technically correct, but I think the general point Paolo is making is we will see in Uruguay an example of a regulated cannabis market with protections against commercialization, or intended protections, and we see in Colorado a regulated market with very few protections against commercialization, and hopefully with unbiased and structured evaluation we'll be able to judge the different results they get. But taking into account cultures, geography, everything else, community. But that at least allows us to start looking at that. Something that worries me about it is we're already seeing a lot of press coverage and reports concluding about Colorado and Uruguay. I saw something in the press today about, what was it, cannabis driving in Colorado. That was a very quick evaluation, So one of our real risks is people trying to come to very quick conclusions of success or failure. Okay, Ruth, good to you.
To add something, I had also the experience of relationship with tobacco industry in my country when we introduced the first program of prevention. And I know how difficult it is, and I know how powerful they can be, and how tricky they can be in advertising that they pretend preventive, but in the meantime they are just saying, for instance, I remember a discussion where one of the advertising they proposed as a contribution to prevention was smoking is something for adults. It's a beautiful message, but not a preventive one, because everybody wants to be an adult, no? So it was really promotion. So I know the difficulty to deal with big tobacco. But in the meantime, we change things. You cannot say that cigarettes are light, because they are not. So you cannot advertise for light cigarettes, no more. You cannot have some ingredients in the cigarette. You cannot smoke in some places. There are a lot of regulation we could bring through, and I think we need this regulation also for drugs. I am really shocked about the picture you show us with the candies and so on. And I remember the fight we had with Alcopops, because we had really to prohibit Alcopops because it was the entry door for alcoholism for children. And I think what you have shown is something similar. So, there is also the possibility to have a market, but with very strong restriction, and the THC level can be controlled, and the mixture of THC and the other stuff can be something. So, yes, also in a free market or more free market, you can really control more than I think you are thinking.
Okay, thank you very much for those questions, and thank you to the panel for their responses. I'll now pass to Nikos to concluding comments.
I just want to thank all the people who participated in this panel. I think it was a very interesting discussion, and always I feel that we have to learn more on that. And what is a reality is that the old strategy has failed. We need more and more space for experiments, for new approaches, to evaluate these approaches and to exchange experiences and good practices. There is no one way for everybody, but of course we have to learn from each other. And I hope that discussion will continue on not only here in the European Parliament, but also at the level of the countries and the states. This is also a difficult discussion because sometimes populism faces the problem with the old methods. And this is, in some countries like Greece, it's a big problem. Okay, I would like to invite also in Greece for a meeting before the European elections, maybe, because it is also, yes, there are a lot of people in prison because there is no alternative and there is